I think three big topics are women, servitude, and warfare in the Old Testament. Those are big ones, and there are some texts that seem troubling to a lot of people, and I think just generally believers too can be troubled by these. But even beyond some of those basic challenges, things like how could God command Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac? Or does a woman have to marry her rapist? Or what about some of those, ceremonial laws, perhaps? Or what about those harsh punishments? Stoning, burning. Is that actually literal? And be prepared for a few surprises here as we unpack that.
Well, I for one am greatly looking forward to it. Ladies and gentlemen, you might notice that suddenly we are in a different location. We're at a new studio. We have an in-person guest, and it's the notorious, the great, the powerful Dr. Paul Copan.
Thanks so much, Brandon. Great to be with you.
I'm actually genuinely super, super excited for the ability to sit across from you and to have this conversation. Literally last night, I was doing a live stream on an atheistic YouTube channel and talking with those guys, making a case for God in general. And we were getting into origin of life, origin of universe, all of these types of questions. But it was interesting because the entire time I couldn't get away from this sense that they did not want it to be true. They did not want God to be true. And I know that sounds a little like I'm psychologizing on them or something, but it really is apparent to me in many of these conversations that I have, and when I read the comments on even my own videos, that there is an emotional, psychological reason to not want to believe when you believe that God is, for example, a moral monster. And personally, I can attest to this because there was a time, as you know, about 10 years ago when I was really wrestling with the nature and character of God. What is God really like? Because if he's not good and loving, then there's something in me that just resists wanting to bow down to him or wanting to be with him. I don't like that.
Yeah. Well, you're right about many atheists who don't have so much of an intellectual problem, in the sense that that's the whole issue. There may be challenges they'll push back on, but someone like Thomas Nagel, New York University philosopher, who, well-known, well-recognized philosopher, who said that he was troubled by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people he knows are religious believers. He says, but he has the fear of religion. And it's this, that he doesn't want there to be a God. He doesn't want a universe to be like that. So he's very frank in his admission that he just doesn't want there to be a God at the center of things. But as you point out, there are other issues that go along with that. You can say, well, the truth of the gospel is there, the truth of the scriptures is there, but some people say, well, the truth may be good and fine, but I want to know if God is really trustworthy, if God is really good, if the gospel story is really beautiful. So truth is important, but what about the goodness and the beauty that also should go with that? And that's an important conversation to have. The people want to see that Jesus is good as well, not simply to know that these things are true, that it's actually the fact that Jesus rose from the dead bodily in history, that this is a fact that can be supported and verified. So taking it a step further is important. So sometimes I'll talk about the moral argument for God's existence. That the moral facts of reality point us to a good God. Well, they'll say, oh yeah, but what about the God of the Old Testament? And it's sort of like all of that is bypassed,
right?
And I want to deal with this stuff. Convince me of this stuff. And so that's an important question to be answering.
And I like that you just said, what about this? Because that's a phrase I've been using a lot, is this idea of like a whataboutism, where you might be talking about topic A, but if the skeptic or seeker's what about is big enough, then it really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's actually that thing on the sideline that needs to be contended with before you could talk about anything else. So that's the reason that I initially reached out to you, given that you're just a few miles down the road, is I thought, let's do something like a series or a bit more of a deep dive rather than just a flyby into some of these critical passages in the scripture that are people's whatabouts. It would be amazing to, create a library of content, a library of videos where if someone says, yeah, but what about this story or this verse or this passage, to be able to say, so glad you brought that up. Here's, a portion of a conversation that's a part of a bigger conversation, but it's a video that just addresses that particular narrative issue that a person has. So that's kind of what we're hoping to do, over time, is to be able to address some of those things. But for today, I think that it would be helpful to give just a little bit more context. So your book is titled, "Is God a Moral Monster?"
Right.
And so I know that the chapter titles, and actually the title of the book, are referencing the language of Richard Dawkins. Is that right?
Yeah, Richard Dawkins and other new atheists like Sam Harris,
Mm-hmm.
Daniel Dennett, and so I'm unpacking a lot of the challenges that they will raise using their slogans about the Old Testament God as my chapter headings. Richard Dawkins said the Old Testament God is the most unpleasant character in all of fiction, and so has a whole long description about what he finds problematic about the God of the Old Testament. So, but yeah, that's my basic approach there to address some of the challenges they raise, but also to go into some depth on these issues, giving some background context and so forth.
I've been reading a couple different things more recently about how some of the gravitas of the new atheist movement is actually fading, and that the relevancy of that is also waning, and that I guess people just have not been as fully satisfied with the conclusions. But I still think I want to hear your thought on that. And I was just also leading in there to say that I think that it is still vitally important to look at what their criticisms were, and for the titles of your books to still be related to that. I still see the effects of it all the time. For example, in the comments section, I still think that these are huge topics to tackle. But would you agree, or do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh yeah, totally.
So tell me a little bit more about this.
Yeah. Well, there's a recent book co-edited by Alistair McGrath. It's called Coming to Faith through Richard Dawkins. And it basically refers to people who are writing about how they had been attracted to Richard Dawkins and his strong claims in defense of atheism, but realizing that it was like a paper tiger, that a lot of these claims that were being made were simply distortions. And also there's an unwillingness by Richard Dawkins and other new atheists that came in the wake of September 11th, an unwillingness to actually engage in arguments. There's just a lot of rhetoric involved. I had a chance to ask Richard Dawkins this question when he was speaking here at Nova Southeastern University, and I asked him about, I said, if we're simply controlled by our, we're just dancing to the music of our DNA, as he says, then why think that atheism is more rational than theism if both the atheist and the theist believe what they do based on physical forces over which they have no control? You can't control the sorts of physical processes that are producing your thoughts, so why think that one view is more rational than another? And he said, well, because science works. And then he went on to say, this is his kind of closing argument, besides, science flies rockets to the moon, but religion flies planes into buildings.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the Muslim terrorists couldn't help doing what they were doing because they were just dancing to the music of their DNA. So on the one hand, he says that there is no good or evil, but then he says, oh, but those Muslim terrorists were evil. They were flying planes into buildings. Well, they couldn't help doing what they're doing, according to Richard Dawkins' own worldview. So again, that's the kind of rhetoric that he uses to kind of throw people off course. So he'll talk about morality on the one hand, but then say, no, there is no morality. He'll say that we're dancing the music of our DNA, but then he'll say, oh, but they were exerting their free will. They should have known better. Well, you can't have it both ways. And that's one of the problems, just that rhetorical stuff that he just doesn't really engage with the argument. And that's been a problem. A lot of critics, and again, this book co-edited by Alistair McGrath, point out that there's a lot of people have been just disillusioned by the new atheist movement. One person, Michael Roos, he said, Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, makes me embarrassed to be an atheist. So he just recognized that there's just a lot of rhetoric, but no real substance involved in these new atheist arguments.
I do feel like there is shrapnel from that movement. And I think that because humans desire something more than a purely materialist model, what has happened, though, is that people have taken away from that they don't like this biblical God. but they also don't like the purely materialist model.
Right.
So now it's more and more so the case that there's this cafeteria approach because we can't get away from our inescapable desire for something more. This is even why I'm like, why are Ouija boards a thing? And why do people have this just, oh, wouldn't that be crazy? What if it moved? What if there was, and we love ghost stories. We love like the numinous, unless it's God. And I always like that. It always fascinates me. Why is there so much skepticism and so much resistance to the biblical God, but so much openness and curiosity to the generally spiritual? And I think that it has something to do with that idea of authority, but I also think it has something to do with the idea of is God good? I want to deal with those hard questions because I think that if people can rethink some concept that they might have of God that may have more cultural baggage in it than a genuine portrait of who God is. So one of my big claims is that if you don't want Christianity to be true, you don't rightly understand it. I really believe that. I really believe that if you rightly understand yourself and your human nature, and you rightly understand the character and nature of God, and you need both of those pieces, because one requires humility and the other requires acceptance. But if you have both of those pieces in place, you will be so excited by who God is and what God has done for us. So for me, it's like, let's look at at those aspects.
Yeah. No, you're right. And one of the things that I am very concerned about doing is to bring the Old Testament and New Testament portrayals of God together, which is what I do in my more recent book, is God, a Vindictive Bully. And one of the things that is very powerful about Jesus is he just comes on the scene with a presumed authority, and he expects people to listen to him, to obey him. And of course, if something like the resurrection is a historical fact, it's not just something that's of historical interest to historians, but this is something that makes an impact on my life. It challenges me. I remember hearing the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright saying, Jesus scares me to death. He's someone who challenges me. He's someone who does not make my life comfortable. But you're right. If Jesus is who he says he is, we find that on the one hand, he'll turn over tables in the temple. And, we actually want a savior who will turn over temples, who will push away injustice, who will deal with the unjust and those who have no concern for the oppressed and dehumanized. But on the other hand, Jesus says, "Come to me, you are weary, I'll give you rest." That Jesus is one who comes to quench the deepest longings of our heart, that he will give the water of life to us. He is the bread of life, and so forth. So you see both of those things, a Jesus who is commanding our authority, but also one, if we put our trust in him, we find rest, peace, and joy.
So with that as a hopefully really beautiful carrot on a string that we want to ultimately get to, I mean, seriously, knowing God through Christ, there is no greater joy that I have found in life. And this is what Christians have been saying for 2,000 years. It's not just I believe ideas, it's I have encountered I've encountered God through Christ, and it becomes the central feature of your life. It becomes the thing that guides all else, and the thing that elevates every other experience. Everything else is infused with the meaning through the knowledge of God. And that's what I desire for the seeker skeptic that listens to these conversations, is you can actually encounter God, and when you do, you're getting a taste of glory, of the future glory that we all will partake of in Christ for eternity. So anyway, that's the setup. I want to dig into the Old Testament a little bit.
Sure.
We want to do this in a little bit more of a systematic way, I think, than what I've seen on some other conversations that you've had, where it kind of feels like it's just bouncing like way all over the place. It's kind of like, what are the big ones? And it's like, kind of doing flybys. I think what would be awesome to transition into the Old Testament is if you can elucidate for myself and also the audience listening, are there some broad principles that are helpful to bear in mind as you look at the books of the Old Testament? And so what are some tools that, as we dig into this conversation, are good to be aware of, broadly speaking?
Right. Well, I think one major pitfall that a lot of people encounter is that the ancient Near Eastern world, the world of the Old Testament, seems so strange. You have these taboos related to blood and to semen, and you have purity laws and pollution, and you're just wondering, I don't get this sort of a thing. It just seems so foreign to us, a world of sacrifices and so forth. We just don't relate to that today. We value freedom. We value individualism. In the ancient Near East, there's a value placed on security, on order, and so forth, which can be in great conflict with how we look at the world through our Western lens. So I think just appreciating some of those things from the ancient Near East will be helpful, rather than just rejecting it because it's different from ours, saying, I want to understand this world, which requires patience, requires charity, where you say, I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt here, rather than just simply rushing to judgment. Sometimes it's a translational issue too. So keeping in mind there are translation problems that, when someone reads a modern translation, which is different from a lot of older translations in English, where the term slave is used, a lot of people immediately think, oh, slave, that's bad. That is something that is like the antebellum South. Well, it's a poor translation, unfortunately, when you look at the Old Testament, that it should be something like worker or servant. And it's a neutral term. It can be something that is, you could be Joshua, Moses. They're called the servant of the Lord, the Eved Adonai. It can be an honorific title, and so rather than seeing it as something degrading, where the person who has charge or is employing this servant can do whatever he wants with him, and so that kind of emotional baggage often comes with translational issues, or the term, quote, utterly destroy. Some of our translations have, well, sometimes it just means exile. People aren't necessarily killed, that it could just simply mean a decisive victory in battle without talking about any sort of annihilation. It's kind of like ancient Near Eastern trash talk. There's hyperbole, there's exaggeration, which is common in Egyptian, Assyrian accounts and so forth. And the Bible picks up on that. So that's helpful to know. There's hyperbole, there's exaggeration. So looking at not just the ancient Near Eastern background and trying to appreciate it for what it is, but also understanding that there are some translational issues, some words that can mislead as we read modern translations. So that's another factor involved here. You also look in terms of, yes, you say verses, and you say, oh, that verse really looks troubling to me. But context, just biblical context itself, can be very helpful. So think about the category of, quote, utterly destroy. If it really means utterly destroy, why does the Bible mention in maybe the same chapter or later on in the book, the same book, that there are lots of survivors, that the same place that has been, quote, utterly destroyed, that also, you have survivors that show up later on. So it must mean something more than that. What does the context actually show us? It's charitable to say, well, how does this fit in with what is being said earlier? Like in Leviticus 25, it says you can acquire foreign servants, just as you can actually acquire an Israelite servant. Later on in Leviticus 25, it says that. But people say, you can acquire a foreign servant. That's bad. Well, it just says in chapter 19 that you are to love the foreigner, the alien in your midst, that you are to love your neighbor as yourself. And the same law that applies to the natives also applies to the foreigners in their midst. So you see throughout the law of Moses 36 times that you too were once foreigners, aliens in the land of Egypt. So look out for the alien in your midst. Those who are most vulnerable, the alien, the widow, the orphan, look out for them. So are you going to give the benefit of the doubt to the broader sweep of this looking out for the vulnerable, the marginalized, which is so thoroughly what the God of the Old Testament is doing? So there is this broader understanding, and it's important to exercise that kind of charitability toward the broader context, rather than just focusing on this individual verse here or there. There's a potential for misunderstanding. And so looking at the broader context of the ancient Near East, trying to appreciate it for what it is, understanding the way in which language is used, maybe in translations that aren't so great, and also looking at the broader context, I think will be very helpful, recognizing that there's something going on in the bigger picture than in that particular individual verse that some people are focusing on and harping on. So those are a few things that I think are important as we unpack these texts to kind of dig in more deeply and see that there is more going on. Let me give an example of how this actually played out in someone's life. Someone came up to me at a conference, and she's an Old Testament scholar, and she said that she's in the middle of her studies in Old Testament, and a lot of these heavy, severe sounding texts were really weighing her down, and she felt like quitting her Old Testament studies. And she read my book, Is God a Moral Monster? And she said, I have some tools here that I can work with that really encourage me, that really help me to see a lot of the background context for understanding these biblical texts, and went on to complete her PhD and is an author and so forth. But it was that book that really helped her to overcome a number of those hurdles to see, oh, let me take a look at the bigger picture and see what's going on here and address some of those things that a lot of people don't delve into. I'm not saying that this clears up all the questions, but on the other hand, it does actually bring a lot of clarity to some of those issues that nag at people that they find troubling.
Yeah, that's really a good overview. The first one thing I want to, I think, circle back to is when you were talking a little bit about slavery. Are you familiar, like the way that the Israelites were enslaved by the Egyptians,
Right.
as compared to the way that the within Israel this all took place? To me, that's always a question I've had, because, and that's something I've also seen online, where at least my understanding of the way in which the Israelites were enslaved by the Egyptians was very forced labor. It was very brutal and not too dissimilar from like American chattel slavery. I'm sure there's actually a lot of differences, but also like basically not great.
Yeah.
Like I guess what I'm saying is, do you tell me a little bit more about slavery in that time period, and because I think that that's helpful. Like,
Yeah.
and I'm sort of, the question is a little bit leading, but at the same time, I really don't know the answer that much about these things.
Yeah. Well, in my book, Is God a Vindictive Bully? I have a couple of chapters that actually look at the worldview differences between the law, just the laws contained in the law of Moses, and those within other ancient Near Eastern law collections. The worldview differences are amazing. There's a fundamental equality, for example, within the land of Israel, as opposed to these other cultures surrounding Israel that had a very hierarchical structure. And so the people at the bottom often got taken advantage of. Punishments against them were more severe than if you're part of the nobility, part of the elite. And so there is no one law to rule them all. Whereas in Israel, this is much different. People made in the image of God and so forth. But when it comes to the matter of servitude, well, yes, and this illustrates my point that you can have the term servitude or servant, or quote slavery, referring to something very negative. So it just depends on the context. That servitude in Egypt was harsh and oppressive, and so the cries of the Israelites come up to God, as it were, and so he addresses their concern and delivers them from Egypt. But it's interesting that the Lord tells Moses to tell Pharaoh, he says, let my people go that they may do what? Serve me in the wilderness. They're going from one servitude, which is negative, to another servitude, which is positive, which is liberating, which is freeing. And so it just illustrates the fact that this can be a term that, depending upon the context, is either negative, positive, or perhaps neutral. So we just have to look at that. So it's not as though there's something inherent in that word, quote, servant, sometimes unfortunately translated slave, that gives us the kind of a negative meaning. But there's something that's going on beyond this very point. So there's also the fact that when you look at the laws surrounding servitude in other cultures surrounding Israel, you'll have like high interest loans for people to pay because they're in poverty. And so it just keeps people further down in poverty. There are no provisions for those who are impoverished to better themselves, to help come out of poverty. But in Israel, of course, what leads people into servitude is because they are poor, because they have no means. And so the Israelite laws say, don't charge interest to those who are poor. Don't keep them further down. Don't keep them in poverty. Help them to come out of poverty. You have gleaning laws, for example, that you can pick from the fields of those who have crops, that you're not to clear everything out or pluck everything from the trees, but let the poor of the land come. Of course, they've got to work for their food, so they've got to harvest. Like in the book of Ruth, where she's harvesting grain and so forth. She's putting in the work. And so you have these sorts of provisions. You have term limits to how long you can keep someone who is a contracted worker for you, a quote servant, 6 years. And then you have to let that person go free with provisions, so that person, who has hired himself out now is free to go, has no lingering debt, and so on. So there is that kind of provision that you just don't have within other ancient Near Eastern cultures. So there's something regulated within the law of Moses that said you cannot keep them longer than this time. And in fact, there's even a provision for a servant to say, hey, this isn't a bad gig. I want to live in my employer's household for the rest of my life. And so there's a ceremony to indicate that. So a person's actually entering freely into servitude rather than it being against that person's will. So knowing that kind of a context, which is far different from the laws surrounding Israel, that can put things into proper perspective. So is it ideal? No, but there are things that we see, redemptive laws that are elevating above what's going on in the other cultures. And, as Jesus said about even permitting divorce, that was permitted. Why? Because of the hardness of people's hearts, not because this is ideal. So there are some arrangements that may not be ideal. It does make them immoral, but they just may be less than ideal because it goes against the way that God designed things from the beginning, as you read Genesis 1 and 2.
There's something I think that is hard for people to understand, and being honest, including myself, about this idea of God working things out as a process. It's like something inside of you is like, is it? First of all, it's like, but what about the collateral damage during that time when things are being worked out as a process? I understand the idea of this elevation or sort of incremental steps towards the higher ethic. But can you say maybe a little bit more about that in case someone has the same questions that I do within that? I know that God has good reasons for allowing history to play itself out, and that he's achieving his purpose. But I just didn't know if you had any thoughts on that particular point.
Yeah. Well, the Apostle Paul in Romans 7 talks about the law of Moses, being good and spiritual and holy, that it is something that is a good provision, and that, as Deuteronomy says, this law is something that is to show the nations around that if Israel is actually carrying out these laws, that they will say, what a wise and understanding people this is. So it's actually to stand out in contrast to the surrounding nations. So there is going to be that sort of a difference. Now, of course, anytime God steps in to interact with human beings, he is going to interact with them at their level in the context in which these people find themselves. And so God is often accommodating himself, the Word becoming flesh, dwelling among us, enduring pain and hardship, identifying with us, living under the law of Moses during his lifetime. And so you see that there is this accommodation that God brings as he enters into this context. The same thing in the Old Testament. The people understood sacrifices. The people understood certain taboos and so on. And so God is working within that kind of a system to, again, elevate the people and to point them in a redemptive direction. So God meets them halfway, but it's far beyond what you see going on in other parts of the ancient Near East. You see God elevating the status of people, women, servants, and so forth. Their humanity is taken for granted. That you see a number of things that are being regulated because God assumes that people are going to sin. So if someone steals something from someone else, what are you to do? So God makes provision for those things. So it assumes a fallenness, and there are ways of regulating things in such a way that things don't get out of control. So rather than seeing the law as kind of the moral ceiling, think of it as the kind of the moral floor that we're dealing with here, that we're dealing with kind of basic concerns here that isn't giving to us a universal ethic for all time, but yet it is not as though it's immoral, but it's trying to bring people in a certain context where there's certain potential abuses given certain structures to step forward and to elevate and try to bring redemption to these people who are living this kind of a situation. For example, in Numbers 21, there are these daughters of Zelophehad who are protesting that the inheritance of their dead father should go to Uncle so-and-so.
Hmm.
And they're saying, why shouldn't that come to us? And so Moses brings that to the Lord. The Lord says, yes, they should receive the inheritance. It shouldn't go to Uncle so-and-so. And so you have, even in this process, a kind of dynamism where certain concerns are being addressed as Israel's history is as it were, being developed. And so this is something that God is willing to, accommodate and to modify, given some of those less than ideal structures that are found within the ancient Near East. So that's just an example of how that can work.
That's great. So, by way of leading into, I think, future content that we hope to do, could you highlight a few of the big pillars that we're kind of going to tackle? I think it would just be good for someone watching this and trying to figure out if what's coming down the pipe. Just maybe tell us a little bit about what are the big topics that we're going to get into.
Yeah, I mean, I think three big topics are women, servitude, and warfare in the Old Testament. Those are big ones, and there are some texts that seem troubling to a lot of people. And I think just generally, believers too can be troubled by these. But hopefully, as we delve in, we'll see some of these things having a broader context, and there's hyperbole, exaggeration, some other things that ought to be brought into consideration that would bring illumination. So, women, servitude, and warfare. But even beyond some of those basic challenges, things like, how could God command Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac? Or does a woman have to marry her rapist? Or does the Bible permit war rape when there's been warfare? What is to be done with women and so forth? So a lot of people think, that the Bible does permit that sort of a thing. Or you'll have other issues like kosher laws. Those are really strange. That just seems so arbitrary and odd. Or what about some of those, ceremonial laws, perhaps? Or what about those harsh punishments? Stoning, burning. Is that actually literal? And be prepared for a few surprises here as we unpack that. And there's a lot more that I address in my books, but we can unpack those as we go.
Well, I, for one, am greatly looking forward to it.
Yeah, thanks so much. Appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. It's going to be good.